The desert sun beat down on the small town like a punishment, drawing long shadows over the dusty main street. Wagons creaked by, boots crunched on the dry earth, and whispers carried faster than the wind. Folks leaned out from porches and saloon doors, not to greet neighbors, but to keep an eye on the cage that sat like a curse in the middle of town. Inside that iron prison squatted a man unlike any they had seen before. Broad shoulders, bronzed skin marked with scars, and eyes that burned hotter than the noonday blaze. He was Apache, a warrior stripped of freedom and pride, sold to spectacle. A hand-painted sign dangled above the bars, $10 to touch the beast. Children stared wide-eyed, women crossed themselves, and men spat on the ground as if to prove they weren't afraid. But everyone knew the truth. Everyone feared the caged Apache. They said he had been captured after a raid, dragged from the mountains by bounty hunters with more greed than courage. Some claimed he had killed a dozen men before they finally broke him. Others swore he was no man at all, but something wilder, something untamed, a beast dressed in human skin. In a town where fear was currency, his presence made business boom. Travelers stopped just to see him. Miners tossed coins for the chance to poke at him with sticks, and drunkards boasted of daring each other to get close. Yet no one touched him twice. His silence was more frightening than a roar, his steady stare more unsettling than a raised weapon. It was as if he knew, deep down, that cage's rust, but patience does not. Still, not a soul dared imagine his fate could change. Not until the widow came. She arrived like a shadow at dawn, quiet but impossible to ignore. Her dress was plain, brown as the earth, and her dark hair hung in a single braid that reached her back. But it wasn't her face or her clothes that caught attention. It was the curve of her swollen belly, carried with both weariness and pride. The widow had been alone since fever took her husband, left with 2 young boys and another life stirring inside her. She was not wealthy, not powerful, not someone people expected to stand in the center of the street with eyes fixed on the iron bars. Yet there she was, staring at the man everyone else had reduced to a monster. Her boys clung to her skirts, whispering questions she did not answer. Dust swirled between her shoes and the cage as she stepped closer, unbothered by the murmurs that followed. The Apache sat cross-legged, unmoving, but his gaze shifted toward her. For the first time in weeks, his expression changed. Not much, just a flicker, like a flame shielded from the wind. But it was enough. The townsfolk noticed. A hush spread down the street. She did not flinch under his eyes. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small cloth bundle. Slowly, carefully, she unwrapped it. The fabric fell away to reveal a gold wedding ring, the only piece of finery she had left, the last remnant of a man she once loved. The ring caught the sunlight, throwing a tiny glimmer into the dust-choked air. She held it up, her hand trembling, though her voice was steady when she spoke. "I'll give this," she said, looking not at the Apache, but at the men who guarded him, to buy his freedom. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Laughter followed, sharp and cruel. The saloon doors burst open with men stumbling out to see if they'd heard right. Buy him? A woman alone, offering nothing but a piece of gold? To them it was foolishness, madness, perhaps even sin. Who would trade something so precious for a man considered a beast? Yet there was no jest in her face, no tremor in her words. She stood her ground, her hand still lifted, the ring gleaming in the sun like a challenge to every sneer aimed her way. The guards exchanged looks, uncertain. They had never been offered anything but coins for glimpses and touches. Never had. Someone demanded more. One of them spat and muttered that she should mind her place, that women had no business meddling with such matters. Another smirked and said if she wanted company, there were easier ways to find it. But still, the widow did not lower her hand. Her boys pressed closer, sensing the weight of the moment without understanding it. And then something happened that froze the laughter in men's throats. The Apache rose to his feet, towering over the bars, his braids falling against his broad chest. His eyes, dark, unyielding, locked on the widow's hand, on the ring that shimmered like a promise. He did not speak, but the silence that fell was louder than any words could have been. It was as though the town itself held its breath. The widow looked at him, not with fear, but with something else entirely. Resolve, a determination born not of wealth or strength, but of necessity, of survival, of a woman who had buried love and yet still carried life within her. In that instant, it was clear she wasn't bartering for spectacle, nor pity, nor madness. She was bargaining for something the town could not name. Perhaps protection. Perhaps redemption. Perhaps both. The crowd shifted uneasily, their jeers dying into murmurs. Some shook their heads, muttering about witchcraft or desperation. Others leaned closer, curious in spite of themselves. The guards barked questions at her, demanding to know why. She said nothing more, only held out the ring, steady and unyielding, as though her silence carried the same weight as his dot. And in that heavy moment, under the burning desert sun, the future of both the widow and the feared Apache hung in the fazana. Balance. The ring glinted once more. The cage groaned as he gripped the bars, and the crowd waited, hearts beating faster, for what would come next. The sheriff stood at the edge of the crowd, arms folded across his chest, squinting at the woman who dared to break the unspoken rules of the town. He was a man used to keeping order by the crack of his voice and the weight of his badge. But even he seemed unsettled by the sight of her holding out that gold band as if it were more powerful than any weapon. For years the people of this desert settlement had lived under the shadow of raids, drought, and the law of whoever held the most guns. Fear had become as common as dust, and the cage in the center of town had been a symbol of control. But now the widow's bold gesture threatened to shake that symbol apart. She did not look at the sheriff. She did not look at the guards or the curious faces pressing closer. Her gaze stayed fixed on the man inside the cage. His hands, bound in iron shackles, rested on the bars, his chest rising and falling with a slow, measured rhythm. He was silent, but his silence carried a weight that made grown men uneasy. The widow's two boys peered at him from behind her skirts, clutching each other's hands. Their eyes were wide, not with fear, but with something closer to wonder. They had never seen a man so strong, so unbroken even in chains. The ring gleamed once more as the sunlight shifted. To anyone else it was only gold, a piece of jewelry, a token of a marriage ended by sickness. But to her it was more. It was the last remnant of a promise, the last fragment of a life torn apart. Offering it now was not foolishness, it was surrender, and yet also defiance. She was staking her future, her children's future, on something no one else in town could understand. Perhaps even she did not fully understand it, but her heart knew what her mind could not explain. Whispers grew louder. Some of the townsfolk muttered that the widow had lost her senses, that grief had driven her mad. Others wondered if desperation had forced her hand. A woman alone, expecting a child, with two little ones clinging to her, it was no secret she struggled to make ends meet. The men of the town had offered her scraps of charity, and a few had made offers of marriage more rooted in convenience than kindness. She had turned them all away. Now she stood in the center of the street, daring to trade the one piece of gold she had left for the life of a man they called a beast. The sheriff finally stepped forward. His boots crunched in the dirt, and the crowd parted, waiting for him to put an end to what they considered nonsense. He eyed the ring, then the widow, then the Apache. His voice came out steady but edged with suspicion. "And what do you aim to do with him if I let you take him?" The words carried over the hush, and every ear leaned closer for her answer. The widow tightened her grip on the ring, her knuckles pale. "He is a man, not a beast," she said firmly. "And I will not see a man caged like an animal when I have something to trade for his life." She paused, drawing in a breath that seemed to steady her trembling frame. "My children need more than pity. They need strength beside them. I believe he can give them that." Gasps rose again, mingled with scoffs and laughter. The sheriff frowned, trying to decide if she was bold or simply broken. The guards looked at one another uncertainly, the coins they had made from curious strangers heavy in their pockets. Freeing the Apache would end their profit, but turning down a gold ring was no small matter either. Greed and fear clashed in their minds, each side pulling at them like two mules tied to the same plow. The widow's words, however, did more than stir debate. They brought memories rushing back to some of the older settlers, memories of skirmishes, ambushes, and raids. The Apache were not strangers to these lands. They had fought tooth and nail to defend their mountains and deserts long before the first cabins had been built. Many in the crowd had lost kin to those battles, or at least heard tales of them. The thought of one of those warriors living among them, even as a servant to a widow, unsettled them deeply. Still, there was something undeniable in the way the caged man stood. He was not broken. The scars on his skin spoke of battles endured, but his spirit had not been crushed. Even in chains, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that no insult could tarnish. The widow saw it, and though others mocked her, a few could not help but see it too. The sheriff's voice cut through the noise again. "You would trust him after what his kind has done?" The question hung heavy, a reminder of blood spilled and grudges carried. The widow's lips pressed into a firm line, and when she answered, her voice did not waver. "I would rather trust a man who has been wronged than men who profit by keeping him caged." The crowd stirred uneasily. Her words were bold, too bold for many to stomach. Some muttered angrily, calling her foolish, reckless, even dangerous. But others fell silent, troubled by the truth hidden in her defiance. They had all walked past that cage, tossing coins to gawk at a man stripped of dignity. None had questioned it until she did. The Apache still said nothing, but his eyes never left her. His hands tightened around the bars, veins standing out on his arms. There was no smile, no softening of his features, only the faintest change in his gaze. To those who watched closely, it was as though the widow's words had stirred something in him that had long been buried under silence and restraint. The sheriff did not answer right away. He weighed the ring against the danger, the widow's resolve against the town's unease. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, waiting for judgment. If he refused, he risked appearing cruel in the face of a woman's plea. If he accepted, he risked unleashing a storm he could not control. For once, the lawman felt caught between two fires. The widow lowered the ring slightly but did not put it away. Her boys clung tighter, sensing the tension even if they did not understand the words. Around them, the crowd shifted, torn between curiosity and fear. The air grew heavy, as if the desert itself held still to hear what would happen next. Even the horses tied along the hitching posts seemed restless, stamping their hooves as though they too felt the weight of the moment. The guards, impatient with the silence, pressed the sheriff for a decision. One of them muttered that gold and a caged man was nothing but trouble. Another warned that freeing him would bring disaster, that he would vanish into the hills and return with vengeance. The sheriff silenced them with a glare but said nothing. His hand rested on the butt of his revolver, not out of intent but habit, as though he knew any choice he made might end in conflict. The widow's hand shook slightly as she raised the ring again. Her voice softened but carried clearly. "I have nothing else to offer. Take this and let him walk free. If you fear what he may do, then let me carry that burden. I will not turn away." The last word echoed faintly across the street, fading into the silence that followed. No one moved. No one dared to speak. All eyes turned back to the cage, to the man inside whose fate now balanced on a widow's resolve and a ring of gold. The Apache's gaze locked on her once more, deep and unyielding, and though no sound escaped his lips, the air around him seemed to hum with unspoken words. The desert sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the cage. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The widow did not move, the ring still gleaming in her hand. The sheriff's jaw tightened as he drew in a slow breath. The guards fidgeted, uncertain, while the crowd held its collective breath. The moment stretched, thin and fragile, ready to snap with the slightest choice. And there, in that fragile pause between judgment and action, the story of the feared Apache and the defiant widow took its first true step into mystery, leaving the town to wonder what storm might break once the cage no longer stood between them. The sheriff finally took the ring, not as an answer, but as a promise that he would think before he ruled. He tucked it into his vest pocket and ordered the cage covered with a canvas sheet against the late sun. The crowd drifted apart in slow knots, talking low, each voice measuring fear against curiosity. The widow led her boys home without looking back. The caged man stood still even as the guards threw the cover over the bars. He did not resist the shadows or the stale heat under the canvas. He waited the way a mountain waits for wind. Word traveled fast along the boardwalks and into the saloon. The saloon keeper took it hard. He had made good coin from travelers who wanted to gawk at the Apache like a carnival show. His face reddened as he poured drinks, and he told anyone who would listen that the town had gone soft. He had other worries, too. For weeks a rancher with more cattle than water had been visiting him at night, asking for a quiet way to push the widow to sell her small place by the wash. That little strip of land, dry for most of the year, held a spring that rose steady. After a rare storm, the rancher did not want to ask fair, and he did not want to wait. Now, with the widow stepping into the center of town, the saloon keeper saw his own plans wobble. He sent a boy with a message that night, telling the rancher that the time had come to act careful and act soon. Back at her cabin, the widow sat on the edge of the bed, one hand on her belly and the other around a chipped cup of water. The boys lay on a pallet near the stove, whispering about the man in the cage, about his braids and scars and the quiet way he watched them. The wind pushed at the shutters. She kept replaying the moment when the sheriff took the ring. She had felt a weight lift and settle all at once. It was not relief. It was the weight of the next step, heavy and unknown. She told herself again why she had done it. Not to stir trouble, not to shame the town. She had done it because every time she walked past that cage, something in her went still and cold. The same stillness she had felt when fever took her husband and the doctor shrugged. A person should not be locked like an animal. A person should not be put on display. If she looked away, her boys would learn to look away too. She could not teach them that. She would rather take on a risk she could see than carry a shame that steals in quietly and stays. The sheriff did not sleep well. He sat at his desk long after the lamps and other windows went dark. The ring gleamed on the wood between stacks of wanted posters. He had worn this badge long enough to know that choices often turned into roads, and once you took a road, it had a way of swallowing your feet. He knew the old stories about raids, knew what the Apache had done and what had been done in return, knew that people remembered only the part that had hurt them. He also knew that the cage had started as a claim by bounty hunters who had no legal right to hold a man beyond the trail. They had left town chasing new prey and never returned. Somewhere, In the drift of weeks, the cage had shifted from a bounty to a business. He poured a measure of coffee that had gone bitter and told himself he would read the law again at dawn. Under the canvas, the captive watched a thin line of moonlight slip through a tear. He closed his eyes and pictured the shape of the nearby hills, the dry riverbed, the slow path of stars across the roof of the world. He smelled the town smoke and the iron and the stale beer and the fear. He did not hate the fear. It made people simple to read. He thought of his father, who had told him that a man does not break when he bends, he breaks when he refuses to bend at all. He had bent in the cage by keeping his body still and his eyes clear. He would bend again if he had to, for a time, for a cause. The face of the woman kept returning to his mind. Not her features, but the way she had stood in front of all the eyes and did not flinch. He had seen warriors stand that way. He had not expected to see it in a town dress and a braid. Morning brought dust and talk. The sheriff called for a hearing. At noon, the church bell rang twice, short and uncertain, as though even the bell feared judgment. The saloon keeper posted a man by the door to whisper to passers-by that the town would burn if the man was freed. The rancher rode in, boots polished, hat too clean for a working day. He spoke softly to the sheriff about prudence, about safety, about keeping women and children from harm. The words were honey. The meaning was steel. He did not mention the spring by the widow's wash. He did not need to. The sheriff heard the part that was not said and disliked that he heard it. The widow arrived with her boys and a small basket of dried apples as a gift for the jailer who had often slipped her extra kindling in winter. She knew kindness like that had to be answered or it withered in the giver. She stood a little back from the cage since the guards refused to lift the canvas until the sheriff gave the word. Around her, townsfolk formed a loose circle. Some met her eyes. Most did not. At noon, the sheriff cleared his throat and spoke in plain language. He said the cage had no proper warrant behind it, that the man inside had never been tried, and that the bounty hunters who brought him had moved on without leaving papers. Said the town had turned law into show and that doing so stained the badge he wore. He did not say what he would do next. Instead, he asked if anyone had claim or charge that could be sworn in public. Silence pooled wide. Then the saloon keeper stepped forward and said the man had been seen near a burned wagon months back. The sheriff asked if he had seen the burning, or the man said it, or anybody. The saloon keeper said no. A miner claimed he had seen tracks like Apache moccasins by the East Ridge. The sheriff asked if he had measured them or only guessed. He had guessed. A few more voices rose with stories of fear and rumor. None held. Wait. The sheriff felt the crowd swell with the old comfort of gossip and the new strain of being told it was not enough. And then the rancher spoke. He did not accuse the man in the cage. He accused the widow. He said her offer was a danger to the town, that it would invite more Apache to come down from the hills. He said she meant well but did not know the ways of war. He said that a woman alone should not carry such decisions. The crowd murmured. The widow's face went pale but not weak. She lifted her chin and said one sentence. She said she would carry what she had to carry to raise her children right. The words landed like fence posts along a line the town had not drawn before. The sheriff raised his hand for quiet and finally spoke the thing that had kept him awake. He said the law could not hold the man. He said he would not keep a person caged for business. He said the man would be turned over to the widow only under strict terms. The town would hold a watch. The man would work for his keep. If harm came to anyone, the sheriff would answer with all the force the badge allowed. He asked the guards to lift the canvas. When the light hit the iron, the captive stood straight. Chains still bound his wrists and ankles, but the guards loosened the lock at the sheriff's nod. The crowd leaned back as if he were flame. He did not look at them. He looked at the widow. She met his eyes and felt a tightness in her chest. It was not fear. It was the weight of having said a thing in public and having it come true. The sheriff told her to lead him away by the old livery road, not the main street. He wanted to calm the town and start the new arrangement in quiet. She agreed. The boys walked on either side of the man, small hands kept close but not touching. He matched their pace exactly, slow and even. The crowd opened like a hard mouth forced wide. The livery road cut behind the saloon, past heaps of broken boards and an abandoned plow. As they walked, the saloon keeper's man moved from the doorway and followed at a distance. The rancher did the same. The widow felt eyes on her back and did not turn. They reached the hitching post where a tired mule stood with patched harness. She had borrowed it from a neighbor for the day, thinking she would haul flour. Now she used the rope to loop a loose lead from the man's wrist to the saddle horn. It was not to bind him so much as to show the town they honored the sheriff's terms. He did not resist the rope. He lifted it once, measured the weight, then let it rest again. On the trail to her cabin, they passed the wash. Dry gravel filled most of the bed, but at one bend the ground darkened and a thin line of water showed. The rancher stared at that dark patch the way a hungry dog watches a bone. The captive noticed it too, and his eyes flicked up to the ridge beyond, then to the sky. He seemed to read something in the line of clouds. He tilted his head as if listening to a sound others could not hear. At the cabin, the widow showed him the shed and a small corral. She offered water first, then a bowl of stew warmed from last night. He ate in silence, each motion careful, as if reminding himself that utensils could serve a man better than fists. The boys watched from the doorway. The older one finally asked if the man had a home. The captive met his gaze and answered in a low voice that his home was far, and that he had people who would think him dead or lost. The widow noticed the way. He said people, not tribe, not warriors, not any word that would feed the fears of the town. She thanked him for his care with words and let him finish the bowl. The sheriff came by before dusk to check on them. He found the man chopping a stack of wood with an old axe and the boys stacking the split logs with solemn pride. The widow stood near the fence, one hand on the curve of her stomach, watching the clouds. The sheriff told her that some in town were riled and that she should keep close to home. He said he would set a deputy to ride by at different hours. He looked at the man and added that this piece was fragile as glass. The captive nodded, a simple show that he understood. That night a storm grumbled on the horizon. Lightning flashed faint behind the hills, and a cool wind came down the arroyo. The widow lay awake and listened to it move through the cottonwoods. She thought of the rancher's eyes and the way he had tried to turn the town against her. She thought of the saloon keeper, angry because a caged man no longer drew coins. She thought of the sheriff, weary but standing inside the lines of his own duty. She thought of the man in the shed, sleeping on a bed of blankets, the rope looped loosely near the door not as a leash but as a symbol for those who might come asking. She wondered if she had tied her family to something larger than any of them. Then the baby pressed against her ribs as if answering. Life inside life. That had to mean something. At the saloon, the rancher met with the keeper in a back room. They spoke about water rights and about how the town would shift if the widow gained a champion as strong as the one now sleeping in her shed. They decided to hire 2 riders who knew the hills and did not mind doing things after dark. The plan was not to spill blood. It was to make fear grow. A gate unlatched here, a ladle missing there. A chicken coop opened in the night. Little things that would be blamed on the stranger and turn the town back toward the cage in their minds. The saloon keeper liked the plan because it would bring his business back. The rancher liked it because pressure often made a widow sell what she did not want to sell. Before dawn, someone knocked on the sheriff's door. The jailer stood wet from the first drops of rain and told him that a rider had come through whispering that a band of men had been seen near the east ridge. The sheriff felt the ring in his vest like a hot coin and told the jailer to wake the deputy. He saddled up and rode out slow, watching for tracks. The rain was light but steady, a blessing and a curse. It softened the ground for water. It softened it for hooves. At the cabin, the widow woke to the sound of a single stone tapping the window. She lifted the latch and looked out. The captive stood there in the gray light, silent. He held out his hand. In his palm lay a small carved token, a piece of wood shaped like a smooth bird. He placed it on the sill and pointed toward the hills where the storm gathered. He spoke only a few words, but they carried weight. Riders in the dark. He had heard them at the edge of sleep, the rhythm of hooves different from the pattern of rain. She felt the old fear rise like cold water and pushed it down. She asked what he needed. He pointed to the wash, to the dark bend where the spring rose after storms. He made a small motion with his fingers that meant watch. She woke the boys and told them to pack bread in a cloth. She took the small pistol her husband had left and checked the cylinder the way the sheriff had taught her after the funeral, one bullet short to avoid misfire. She did not like guns, but she liked helplessness even less. The captive moved to the corral and slipped a rope halter over the mule. He tied a second piece of rope to the old fence post and shook it until the wood loosened. He was not breaking. He was testing. The post held. The first real crack of thunder came when the sun edged the horizon. The sky turned the color of iron. The wind slid over the grass and dropped into the wash with a cold hiss. Somewhere in that wind the riders moved, hidden by brush and weather, thinking themselves unseen. The widow stood at the fence with the pistol hidden under her shawl. Her boys pressed close. The captive at her side with nothing in his hands but his own strength, and the calm of a man who had listened to storms all his life. He looked at the ridge, then at the water, then at the line of the cabin roof as if measuring angles. The first rider showed at the far bend, just a shadow on a horse, then another behind him and a third off to the left. They did not come fast. They came like men who hoped to go to mistake. The mule snorted. The boys gripped the fence rails. The widow felt her heart climb into her throat and stay there. The captive raised one hand, palm outward, a sign used in many tongues that meant wait. The wind paused. The rain thickened. The riders spread out. No one had fired a shot. No one had spoken. Yet the moment felt tighter than a rope-pulled drumhead. Tight. The sheriff was still a mile off, following tracks that the rain was already blurring. In town, the saloon keepers set out fresh mugs, expecting trouble to drive business. The church bell stayed quiet. The rancher, dry under his porch roof, watched the hills and told himself it was only pressure, not harm. At the cabin fence, the widow kept her eyes on the nearest rider and her hand steady under the shawl. The captive set one foot on the bottom rail as if ready to move in any direction the moment demanded. He did not look at her, but his voice, when it came, was low and clear enough for only her to hear. He asked if she trusted the ground beneath the spring. She said yes. He nodded once, like a man who had found the start of a path. The riders reached the line where the wash curved and the ground turned dark. One of them lifted a hand as if to wave. Another leaned forward in the saddle. The third shifted his horse to the higher bank. The sky broke with a single bright flash, and the storm moved in full. What it carried toward the wash and the cabin was not yet clear. The captive's hand dropped from the rail. The widow drew the shawl tighter and took one step along the fence, matching his angle without knowing why. The boys stayed still, eyes wide. Water began to gather at the bend and push against the stones with a soft, dangerous sound. The riders urged their horses closer to the bend, confident and slow. The ground in front of them looked firm. It was not. The storm came down hard, the kind that turned air heavy and made every sound sharper. Rain hit the wash in wide sheets, gathering fast into small streams that joined into one push of water. The riders slowed when the ground softened, but they did not stop. Their horses stepped careful, ears flat, uneasy with the smell of wet earth. The widow gripped the fence rail with one hand, the pistol steady in the other, her shawl clinging to her shoulders. The boys pressed against her sides, their breath quick. The captive stood still, his eyes never leaving the riders, reading each motion as if the storm itself were speaking through them. The leading rider leaned low in his saddle, his eyes on the dark bend of the wash where water pooled against stone. His horse pawed at the ground, sensing the shift underfoot. The second rider urged forward, trying to force momentum where the earth no longer held firm. The third stayed high on the bank, watching with a kind of patience that did not belong to a simple hired hand. His eyes stayed fixed on the cabin, on the widow standing firm with her children and the stranger beside her. The storm wrapped them all in a silence that was loud with waiting. The captive lifted his chin toward the bend, his hand making a small circle in the air as if marking the way water would turn. The widow caught his meaning without words. She whispered to the boys to stay behind the fence, no matter what they saw, no matter what they heard. Her oldest nodded, though his face was pale. The younger clutched her skirt and would not let go. She kept her hand on the pistol, though she felt the weight of it like a stone, not a weapon. It was not her nature to threaten with steel, but she had promised herself she would not freeze again the way she had when her husband took his last breath. She would act if she had to, even if her hand shook. The riders spoke low to one another, voices hidden under thunder. They thought they had the advantage. They thought a widow's cabin was easy ground to unsettle. They did not see how the wash had changed in the storm, or how the ground they pressed into was shifting from solid clay to a skin of mud. The captive stepped one pace forward, slow and even, his chains rattling with the sound of rain. He did not raise his voice, he did not need to. The riders felt his presence, the same way a man feels the weight of a storm cloud overhead. One of them spat to the side, more to break his own nerves than to insult. His horse jerked at the sound, hooves slipping on slick earth. The captive watched the stumble with a calm that looked too steady for the moment. The widow saw the same thing and felt her chest tighten. She sensed that the ground itself might turn into a weapon, one she had not called for, but one the storm had delivered. She knew if the riders pressed too far, the wash would take them. She also knew if it did, the blame would fall not on the storm, not on greed, but on the man standing beside her. She could hear already how the saloon keeper would spin the tale, how the rancher would nod and spread his own version. Her heart pounded with the thought that truth alone might not be enough to save them. The sheriff was still out on the ridge, following faint tracks that the rain washed away with each passing minute. His horse labored against the mud, and his eyes scanned for any sign of men on the move. He did not know yet that the very men he sought were already circling the widow's cabin. He only knew the ring in his vest pocket grew heavier with each mile, as though it carried a weight beyond gold. He had promised himself he would not let the town turn law into theater again, but he also knew how quickly fear could rewrite memory. He pressed his horse forward, urgency biting at him. At the cabin, the tension pulled tighter. The first rider dismounted, thinking he could cross the wash on foot, his boots sinking into the mud with each step. He kept his rifle slung but his hand close to it. The second rider followed, muttering a curse when the water rose over his ankles. The third remained on horseback, circling to higher ground, his eyes scanning for a weak point in the widow's stance. He saw her hand tucked under the shawl, saw the edge of steel glint in the stormlight, and for the first time he hesitated. A widow with a pistol was not the show of weakness he had expected. A stranger at her side made it worse. He slowed his horse, calculating. The captive stepped closer to the wash, his feet sinking but steady, his eyes on the riders without fear. His presence was not challenge, not threat, but it carried a weight heavier than either. It was as if he stood between the storm and the town, one man holding the line. The widow felt it too. She saw in him the same stillness she had seen in the cage, now turned outward, shaping the storm to his own measure. She wanted to speak, to tell him not to risk himself, but she bit the words back. She knew he would not listen. He was listening to something larger, something she could not hear. The first rider slipped, falling to one knee in the rising water. His horse whinnied from the bank, pulling back against the reins. The second cursed again, reaching to pull his partner up, but the mud gave way faster than his grip. The water, swollen by the storm, began to pull at their legs with a strength that startled them both. The third rider cursed it under his breath, realizing too late that the ground he had chosen was sliding too, the edge of the bank breaking into the wash. The horses reared, panicked by thunder, and the smell of rushing water. The widow's heart raced. She knew this was the moment everything turned. If the riders were swept away, the blame would fall on her, on the captive, on the storm that no one could command. If they crossed and reached the cabin, her family would be caught in the middle of a plan built by men who wanted her land and her silence. She tightened her grip on the pistol, her finger near the trigger. She prayed she would not have to fire. She prayed the storm would decide for her. The captive raised both hands, palms outward, a sign of warning, a plea to turn back. His voice cut through the rain, low but carrying. He told them to stop, told them the ground was not theirs to walk, told them the storm would not spare them. The riders heard, but pride and coin weighed heavier than sense. The one in the wash pulled free and stumbled forward, his rifle raised now, no longer patient. The second steadied himself and followed. The third kicked his horse down the slope, mud flying as hooves tore into soft ground. They came on, stubborn against the storm. The widow felt her breath stop. The boys clung to her skirts, their eyes wide and wet. The captive braced, every line of his body ready for what was coming. The sheriff was still too far, his figure a shadow on the ridge, unaware of the moment tightening at the cabin. The saloon keeper poured whiskey in town, waiting for the news he thought would come. The rancher sat dry under his porch, his eyes fixed on the hills, his mind already shaping how he would tell the story to his favor. The storm roared, the wash surged, and the riders pressed closer, caught between their own greed and the power of the flood. The widow raised the pistol, her hand shaking, her lips whispering a prayer she could not finish. The captive took one step forward, chains dragging in the mud, his eyes fixed not on the men but on the storm itself, as if he could call it to his side. The moment stretched, every sound sharper, every breath louder, every motion slowed by the weight of choice. The riders broke through the wash just as the water swelled again, their rifles glinting, their horses screaming against the pull of mud. The widow felt the trigger under her finger, the cold metal a choice she could no longer delay. The captive lifted his hands higher, his voice rising against the storm. The sheriff reached the lower ridge and saw at last what was unfolding, his hand flying to the revolver at his hip as he kicked his horse into a desperate run. The storm cracked the sky wide open, lightning flashing so bright it turned the wash into a silver river. The riders pushed forward, their eyes locked on the cabin, their intent sharp and certain. The widow held her breath. The captive stood tall. The sheriff rode hard. The storm swallowed the moment, holding everything on the edge of what would come next. The lightning tore across the sky again, white fire splitting the clouds, and for a breath, the whole world froze in its glare. The riders looked like shadows carved against the storm, their rifles raised, their horses lunging through mud, and rising water. The widow's hand shook on the pistol, the boys clutched to her skirts, and the captive Apache stood tall at the edge of the wash, his hands lifted as though he could hold back the flood itself. The sheriff came pounding down the ridge, his horse straining, his coat snapping in the wind. Everything met at once, a knot of fear, defiance, and raw will. The wash broke first. The bank gave way with a deep roar, water spilling over in a rush that swallowed the riders' legs and pulled hard at their horses. Mud ripped from the slope, dragging them sideways. One rider dropped his rifle to grab the reins, his shout lost in thunder. Another clung to his saddle horn as his horse slid beneath him, eyes rolling white. The third turned his mount uphill, but the ground tore beneath the hooves, and both went tumbling into the current. The widow gasped, her hand jerking back from the pistol as she saw men thrown helpless into the storm's grasp. The captive did not move. His eyes stayed fixed, watching, not gloating, not pitying, only bearing witness to the storm's choice. Sheriff reached the wash just as the riders fought to free themselves. He swung down, boots sinking deep, and waded into the flood. His revolver stayed holstered. His voice cut sharp and steady through the chaos, ordering the men to hold fast to the bank. With a rope pulled from his saddle, he threw one end across to the first rider, dragging him toward safety. The second clawed his way through the current, spitting mud and curses, and managed to crawl to higher ground. The third, his horse lost to the water, clung to a branch until the sheriff reached him, hauling him back with a force that bent his shoulders. The storm raged, but man's will clung harder. When it passed, all three riders lay soaked and shivering, their rifles gone, their pride drowned. The widow lowered her pistol at last. Her arms ached from the weight she had carried, not just of steel but of choice. The boys sobbed with relief, clinging to her sides. She whispered soft words, kissing their hair, steadying them with a voice she hoped would never tremble again. The captive turned his gaze from the storm to her, and for the first time since he had been brought to the town, there was a glimmer in his eyes that looked almost like peace. The sheriff stood tall, dripping, mud-streaked across his face. He looked to the widow, then to the captive. His hand went to the pocket of his vest where the ring lay heavy. He thought of the town waiting in the saloon, waiting for a story twisted to suit their fears. He thought of the rancher counting on land claimed not by right but by might. He thought of the saloon keeper's whispers, the hunger of men who found profit in lies. He saw the widow's strength, her boy's eyes shining with both fear and trust, and the captive's unbroken silence that spoke more than words. The sheriff made his choice. He turned to the riders, still coughing river water, and declared in a voice loud enough to carry through storm and memory alike that the man in chains was no criminal, no beast. He was a survivor wronged by those who had tried to cage him, and tonight the storm itself had set him free. The widow felt tears rise, hot and fierce. She stepped forward, untying the knot that bound the man's wrists, her fingers trembling not from fear but from release. The chains fell into the mud with a dull weight, sinking into earth as though they belonged to another world. The captive flexed his hands, the skin raw, the scars deep, yet his bearing still proud. He looked once at the sheriff, once at the widow, then lifted his face to the sky, rain washing over him, as if claiming back a freedom that had been his since birth. The riders stayed low, shamed into silence. Their plan had failed, their greed stripped bare by storm and law alike. They had no words to answer the sheriff, no excuses to offer. They knew the town would learn of their failure, and in the telling, their names would carry the stain of defeat. They would not return as victors, but as men undone by nature and truth. When the storm eased and the clouds broke, the land lay quiet again, though scarred by water's passage. The sheriff helped the widow gather her boys, his hand steady on her shoulder. She thanked him, her voice soft, carrying all the weight of what she could not say. The captive stood beside them, silent still, but his presence was no longer shadowed by threat. It was strength, calm, and the promise of a life no man had the right to cage. By morning, word had spread. The saloon filled with whispers. The rancher sat with clenched jaw, and the townsfolk listened to every tale carried back from the storm. Some scoffed, unwilling to let go of fear. Others nodded, uneasy but aware that the truth had broken through like sunlight after thunder. The sheriff spoke plain. He told them the storm had tested every soul, and only those who stood with courage had come through. He told them the widow had shown more steel than any man in that room, and the captive had stood unbowed against both storm and slander. He told them no law worth keeping could justify a cage built on hate. The room fell quiet, and though not all agreed, no one dared to challenge him. The widow returned to her cabin, her boy safe at her side. The land would not grow easier, the work not lighter, but she carried something stronger than before. She had faced down both men and storm and had not faltered. Her husband's memory no longer felt like a burden of loss but a guide for courage. She had defended her home, not with bullets, but with resolve that no storm could wash away. The captive remained near for a time, working in silence, lending strength where strength was needed, not asking, not taking, only giving what he could. The boys came to watch him with wide eyes, not with fear, but with respect. In their laughter and trust, something began to heal. As weeks passed, the storm scars faded, grass growing green where water had carved its path. The town carried on, no quieter, the story of the cage lingering like a shadow that would not fade. Some still feared, but others had learned. The sheriff carried the ring still, not as a debt but as a reminder that justice was not in steel or stone, but in choice. The widow worked her land, her heart steady. The captive moved on when the time was right, walking into the hills with the same silence that had always been his, leaving behind not chains but the mark of a man unbroken. In the end, the lesson was not about storm or steel, but about the courage to stand when standing seemed impossible. The widow had shown it. The sheriff had claimed it. Even the storm had mirrored it. The town would remember in its own way, but those who were there knew the truth. That night, a cage was broken, not just of iron, but of fear. That night, a widow and a man the world had cast aside stood together, and in doing so, they proved that even in the harshest land, dignity and courage could take root. The land was still rough, the future uncertain, but hope had found its place again. The widow held her boys close, watching the horizon. The sheriff rode on, his eyes steady, his hand never straying from the ring in his pocket. And somewhere beyond the hills, the freed man walked beneath open sky as it was always meant to be. The story closed not with thunder, but with quiet. Strength, a reminder carried on every wind that true freedom is not given, but lived.